There is a hare in the painting, and the painting is on a wine cup, and the wine cup belongs to a man who is 40 and watching a boy who is 14. The hare is a courtship gift. The boy is supposed to refuse it for a while, and then maybe accept it, and then probably refuse it again. This is classical Athens, somewhere around the time Pericles is running the city. You, in this scenario, are the boy. Today you find out exactly how an entire civilization built a 600-year tradition around a single category of intensely regulated teenage romance, complete with laws, philosophy, gymnasium, etiquette, and a death penalty for slaves who walked into the wrong room. Welcome to the job. Nobody asked you. The Greek word for what you are is Eromenos, which means, very plainly, the loved one. Your counterpart, the older guy with the hair, is the Erastes, which means the lover. Modern historians, following the British classicist Kenneth Dover and his enormously influential 1978 book Greek Homosexuality, use these two words as the standard technical terms for the two sides of the institution. Dover's framing has been argued about ever since, but the vocabulary stuck. Your age is the first thing the system fixes. Athenian sources put the ideal Eromenos somewhere between 12 and 17 years old. The defining physical mark is the absence of a beard. The moment your facial hair fills in, around 18 or 20, you are no longer eligible. You graduate, basically, into adulthood, military service, and the reverse role. The relationship has a built-in expiration date that is biologically printed on your face. Your social class also matters, intensely. The institution, as Athens practiced it, is overwhelmingly an aristocratic and upper-middle thing. Wealthy boys in private schools, sons of citizens, attending the gymnasium during the long Mediterranean afternoons, bumping into men of their father's status. It was not a thing that happened to slaves. Slaves were specifically forbidden from participating, and we will get to that, because Athenian law in this area is unhinged in ways that nobody warns you about in a generic Greek history class. Solon wrote the rulebook in 594 BC. Athens had a famous lawgiver named Solon who, around the year 594 BC, did a wholesale rewrite of Athenian civic law. Among everything else, he wrote the regulations governing your life as a teenage boy. These laws are preserved for us through the orator Aeschines, who quotes them at length in a speech we will get to in a moment, and through later writers like Plutarch. The Solonian rulebook has some surprises. First, schoolrooms must open after sunrise and close before sunset, with an explicit list of who is allowed inside while boys are present. The teacher, the teacher's son, the teacher's brother, the teacher's son-in-law. That is the entire list. Anyone else found inside the schoolroom during operating hours faces a penalty that, in some versions of the law, is literally death. Athenian fathers were taking this seriously enough to put a price tag on the wrong adult walking through a door. Second, slaves are forbidden from exercising in the gymnasium and forbidden from courting freeborn boys. Aeschines makes a big deal of this. The law is not protecting slaves, it is protecting the boys, and it is also protecting the institution itself. The whole structure of Athenian pederasty assumes that both parties are citizens or future citizens, that this is a relationship between social equals, separated only by age. The presence of a slave in the equation breaks the social contract, so the law breaks the slave's leg, metaphorically and sometimes literally. Third, there are explicit laws against pimping out your son. A father or guardian who rented a freeborn boy out for sex was committing a serious crime. The boy, on becoming an adult, was then released from the legal obligation to support that father in old age. Your dad sells you, your dad starves later. Athens did not mess around with this part. The whole codified package is a paradox in legal form. The state simultaneously protected freeborn boys from predatory access, and assumed that those same boys would, eventually, be courted by older men under specific rules. Your father will pray that you are handsome, says Aeschines, knowing that handsome attracts admirers, and then he will hire a slave to watch you so closely that you can barely breathe. Your father hired a slave to stalk you. His name is the pedagogos, literally the boy leader. He is a household slave, often elderly, often Asian or Thracian, and his entire job is to escort you everywhere. He walks you to school, he walks you home, he waits while you exercise, he carries your wax tablet and your lunch. He memorizes who said what to you in the street and reports back to your father in the evening. In modern terms, he is a chaperone, a bodyguard, and a tattletale, simultaneously. The Athenian household paid him in food and lodging. The Athenian household trusted him with the most precious asset in the family, which is the unbroken civic future of its only male heir. There is something deeply weird about an institution that places the moral guardianship of an aristocratic Athenian boy in the hands of a foreign slave whose own consent to the arrangement nobody ever recorded. The pedagogue's job is also why surviving Athenian comedy is full of pedagogue jokes. The slave who is too old to keep up with the boy. the slave who falls asleep in the corner, the slave who gets bribed by a hopeful suitor to look the other way for 10 minutes. There is at least one famous fragment, attributed to a comic poet, where a pedagogue confesses he has accidentally lost his charge in the agora and is now considering whether to lie about it or run away. Aristocratic Athenian fathers were generating, structurally, a large class of badly paid people whose job it was to follow you around and who almost certainly resented the assignment. The gymnasium is not really about sport. The word gymnasium comes from the Greek gymnos, meaning naked. Athenian male athletics were performed entirely without clothing, in oiled bodies and on sand. The Academia, the Lyceon, and the Kynosarges, the three big public gymnasia of classical Athens, are simultaneously sports facilities, philosophical schools, and the social hub where every adult man in the city regularly looked at every adolescent boy in the city. If you are an Eromenos, this is your environment. You go to the palestra, the wrestling ground, every afternoon. You strip, you oil, you wrestle. The men who are not exercising sit on benches around the edge and watch. There is no awkwardness about this in the source material. The very same men, in their own youth, were watched in exactly the same way. The visual record is staggering. Modern museums hold thousands of Athenian black figure and red figure vases that depict gymnasium scenes, courtship scenes, and explicit pederastic scenes. Over 200 surviving Attic red figure vases show pursuit and gift sequences specifically. The men hold out gifts. The boys stand in characteristic poses, sometimes accepting, often turning aside. The most common gifts on these vases are the hare and the rooster. The hare is fast and elusive, and famously fertile. The rooster is aggressive and, in Athens, a fighting bird associated with male valor. Both are essentially metaphor packages handed across the gymnasium fence. There are also lyres, perfume jars, javelins, and, occasionally, more practical things like wreaths or sandals. There is an entire art historical literature on what each gift means and which ones implied seriousness rather than a casual approach. Nobody on these vases is ever holding a hare, ironically. The etiquette is insane and also the whole point. Here is where the institution gets genuinely strange. The cultural rule, repeated by every classical Athenian source we have, is that you, the Eromenos, are supposed to make this difficult. You should not accept the first gift. You should not accept the second. You should make the older man chase you across multiple gymnasia, multiple festivals, possibly multiple years. You should test his sincerity. You should turn away when he speaks. You should, at the symposium, sit at the far end of the couch and not laugh at his jokes. You should look bored. Your reluctance is the most respectable thing about you, and it is the thing the entire culture watches for. A boy who said yes too fast was called a kinidos, a word so loaded with Athenian disgust that it has no good English equivalent. It implied an enthusiastic willingness that, by Athenian definitions, was simply incompatible with male citizenship. This is the part of the institution that modern readers find the most jarring. The cultural ideal is courtship without obvious enthusiasm, attention without eagerness, a relationship in which one party is supposed to act, almost permanently, as if he is barely tolerating it. The reasons given by Athenian writers themselves boil down to civic anxiety. A boy who appeared to enjoy being pursued might, the worry went, eventually accept gifts in exchange, which is to say money, which is to say prostitution, which under Athenian law was a permanent disqualification from political life. The entire culture is dancing around a single legal trap, and your job is to dance around it for 5 years without falling in. Plato walks into a symposium. Around 385 BC, the philosopher Plato writes a dialogue called the Symposium, in which a group of well-dressed Athenian men gather, drink an ostentatious amount of wine, and take turns giving speeches in praise of love. The speeches are given by named historical figures, including the playwright Aristophanes and a politician called Pausanias. Pausanias gives the most explicit defense of the Athenian system anywhere in classical literature. There are two kinds of love, he says, the heavenly and the common. The common kind goes after bodies, runs out as soon as the bloom of youth fades, and is generally what you find in lesser cities. The heavenly kind is directed at the soul of the beloved, lasts for life, and produces virtue, courage, and good citizens. According to Pausanias, the rule at Athens is built precisely to test which kind a particular admirer is bringing. The lover who runs away when you refuse him 3 times is the common kind. The lover who patiently demonstrates that he is in this for your character is the heavenly kind. The Eromenos' job is to be the test. This is the philosophical sales pitch, and it is also the most useful framework for understanding why the rules look the way they do. The institution, in its idealized form, was supposed to be a kind of intensive moral mentorship. The Aeschines funds your education, introduces you to civic life, walks you into the assembly when you are old enough, and in exchange asks for an emotional and possibly physical relationship that will be, in theory, dignified. A few speeches later in the same dialogue, the playwright Aristophanes gives the most famous Athenian story about love anyone has ever told. Human beings, he says, were originally double creatures, with 4 arms, 4 legs, and 2 faces, until Zeus split them in half. Each of us spends our lives looking for our missing half. The myth is delivered as a comic speech, but it has shaped Western literature for 2,400 years, and it sits, casually, inside a dialogue that is officially a defense of pederasty. Aristophanes treats male-male, male-female, and female-female pairs as equally valid halves of the original beings. The speech you remember from your high school English class as a generic origin story for soulmates was originally a piece of pederastic philosophy. Whether this actually worked the way Pausanias describes it is a question every classicist has fought about since 1978. Dover argued the physical side was real and central. James Davidson, in his 2007 book The Greeks and Greek Love, argued that a lot of these relationships were probably non-physical or only awkwardly physical, and that the Athenians themselves were embarrassed when they got specific about it. Modern scholars now mostly land somewhere in the middle. The institution was real, the rules were real, the practice varied wildly from couple to couple, and the surviving sources are written almost entirely by men who had a stake in making it sound respectable. Alcibiades tries to seduce Socrates. It goes badly. The single most famous Eromenos story in classical Athens is told, in person, by the Eromenos himself, very drunk, at the end of the symposium. His name is Alcibiades. He is the most beautiful, most arrogant, most politically dangerous young man of his generation, the future general who will eventually betray Athens to Sparta and Sparta to Persia. At the moment of the story, he is in his early 20s, and the older man he has been chasing is the philosopher Socrates. Alcibiades crashes the dinner party already wasted, demands a turn to speak, and announces that he is going to give his speech in praise of love about Socrates personally. He then tells the room a story that should not exist in a respectable text. He invited Socrates to dinner. He sent the slaves away. He stripped. He climbed into the same bed. He propositioned the philosopher directly, and Socrates, the older man in this scenario, simply went to sleep next to him, as if Alcibiades were his brother. The whole script of Athenian pederasty has been inverted. The Eromenos, who is supposed to refuse, is begging. The Aeschines, who is supposed to pursue, is unbothered. The point Plato is making, by writing the scene this way, is that Socrates has somehow risen above the institution entirely. He is not the ordinary Aeschines, charmed by a beautiful body, but the philosophical Aeschines who is interested only in the soul, and Alcibiades' soul is not yet ready. The point Alcibiades is making, by telling this story drunk in front of his peers, is that he has been humiliated by the only man he ever genuinely wanted, and he is bringing that humiliation into the light, because he cannot stop thinking about it. It is one of the most psychologically dense scenes in any ancient text. It is also a very strange place to sit if you are a 14-year-old reading this dialogue in school 3 centuries later, because the scene only makes sense if you already know all the rules it is breaking. Then a lawyer named Aeschines tries this in court. In 346 BC, the orator Aeschines is locked in a brutal political feud with another politician, a man named Timarchus. Aeschines does not have a strong direct case against Timarchus, so he pulls a lever that classical Athenian law has handed to him. He charges Timarchus with having prostituted himself as a young man, which, under Solon's old laws, would automatically strip Timarchus of the right to address the assembly. The resulting speech, against Timarchus, is one of the longest and most readable single sources we have on Athenian sexual law. Aeschines spends an hour and a half walking the jury through the rulebook. He explains, citing Solon, that an Athenian citizen who has sold his body in his youth permanently loses the right to speak in the assembly, hold any office, serve as a herald, perform priestly duties, or even enter the Acropolis on a feast day. The legal term for this status is atimia, a word that essentially means civic death. He then goes on to describe, in fascinated detail, the gossip about Timarchus's adolescence, the houses he lived in, the men who paid for him, the dinner parties at which he was passed around. He never claims to have witnessed any of this himself. The whole thing is street rumor structured as legal argument, and the genius of it is that, by Athenian standards, the rumor is enough. Aeschines is not asking the jury to convict on physical evidence. He is asking them to convict on reputation. He wins. Timarchus is stripped of citizenship. He retires from public life and, according to one later source, dies by suicide. Demosthenes, the most famous Athenian politician of the period, who had been on Timarchus's side, never quite forgives Aeschines. The whole thing is essentially a courtroom thriller about whether a politician spent his teenage years being too obviously enthusiastic in the gymnasium. If you are an Eromenos when this trial is going on, the lesson is brutally clear. Your reputation in your teenage years, accurately recorded or merely whispered, will follow you into the assembly 30 years later. Your conduct in the palaestra is a permanent civic credential. Athens has built a system in which adolescent gossip is binding for life. Sometimes, the Eromenos stabs the tyrant. In 514 BC, an Athenian aristocrat named Hipparchus, the brother of the tyrant Hippias, made an unwanted advance toward a young man named Harmodius. Harmodius was the Eromenos of an older man named Aristogeiton. He refused Hipparchus and reported the incident to his lover. Hipparchus, humiliated, retaliated by publicly insulting Harmodius's young sister at the next Panathenaic festival, denying her a ceremonial role in the procession. Harmodius and Aristogeiton, in response, decided to assassinate the tyrant. The plot was clumsy. They killed Hipparchus but failed to kill the actual ruling tyrant Hippias. They were caught and executed. Hippias remained in power for 4 more years, until the Spartans showed up in 510 BC and chased him out, paving the way for the democratic reforms of Cleisthenes. The Athenian democracy that followed adopted Harmodius and Aristogeiton as founding heroes. Statues of the pair were erected in the Agora, becoming so culturally iconic that, when the Persians sacked Athens in 480 BC and carried the original bronzes off as trophies, the city commissioned identical replacements as soon as possible. The pair was sung about at drinking parties. Their tomb received state offerings. Thucydides, writing a generation later, was uncomfortable with the heroic version and pointedly noted that the assassination was personal rather than political. The democracy did not care. The image of the Eromenos stabbing the tyrant who had insulted his sister was simply too good to give up. The implication, if you are a 14-year-old Eromenos in a later century, is that your relationship is potentially the first line of defense against tyranny. This is the kind of mythology a culture tells itself to sleep at night, and the Athenians repeated it for 2 centuries. Athens sneers at Thebes for doing it differently. Just north of Athens, in the city of Thebes, the same institution operated with one very specific local twist. The Thebans took the relationship out of the gymnasium and into the army. Around 378 BC, a Theban general named Gorgidas formed a hand-picked unit of 300 soldiers organized into 150 pairs, each pair consisting of an Erastes and his Eromenos. They were called the Sacred Band. The military logic was simple. No man would commit a shameful act in front of the person he loved. No man would abandon his beloved on the battlefield. An entire phalanx of these pairs would, in theory, fight harder than any equivalent force of unrelated men. The reasoning came directly out of Plato's Symposium, of all places. In practice, the Sacred Band they beat the Spartans, who had been considered unbeatable for 2 centuries, at the Battle of Tegeira in 375 BC. They were the elite spearpoint of the larger Theban force at Leuctra in 371 BC, the engagement that finally ended Spartan supremacy in Greece. They went undefeated for 40 years until they were finally annihilated, to the last man, by Philip II of Macedon and his teenage son Alexander at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. Philip is said to have wept when he toured the battlefield and saw all 300 of them lying together. The Athenians, despite their entire civic identity being built on pederasty, found the Sacred Band slightly embarrassing. Xenophon's Socrates, in his own version of the Symposium, says the Theban habit of putting lovers next to each other in battle was acceptable for Thebans, but would be shameful for Athenians. Athenians wanted the institution as a private mentorship and a mark of aristocratic refinement. They did not want it as a battlefield strategy. The exact same set of relationships, deployed slightly differently, was either the highest expression of civic virtue or a national embarrassment, depending entirely on which side of Mount Cithaeron you grew up on. So how do we look at this now? The honest answer is that historians have been arguing for 50 years and nobody has won. Kenneth Dover's 1978 book treated the institution as a more or less ordinary feature of an unequal society, with explicit physical content and a clear active and passive division. Foucault picked up Dover's framework in the 1980s and turned it into a story about the construction of sexuality. James Davidson in 2007 pushed back hard, arguing that Dover had projected too much modern explicitness onto the evidence, and that many of these relationships were chaste or only loosely physical. Thomas Hubbard, the editor of the standard sourcebook on the subject, sits closer to Dover. Subsequent scholars, mostly working in gender studies and classics together, occupy every position in between. There is also the question of mythology, which makes everything messier. The Athenians themselves loved to argue about whether Achilles and Patroclus, in Homer's Iliad, were a pederastic couple. The Iliad never actually says so. Homer simply describes them as inseparable companions. But 5th century Athens was so saturated with the institution that Aeschines wrote a tragedy, assuming Achilles was the Erastes, and Plato has the speaker, Phaedrus, in the Symposium, argue at length that no, actually, Achilles must have been the Eromenos because he was the younger and more beautiful one. 2 Athenian intellectuals are arguing, with a straight face, about which Trojan war hero was on top. The argument tells you everything about how the institution had reshaped even the Greek reading of their own oldest poetry. What everyone agrees on, more or less, is this. The institution was real, it was age asymmetric, it was deeply embedded in Athenian aristocratic life for at least 3 centuries, and it produced an unusual combination of legal protections for boys and cultural pressures on those same boys to perform a very specific kind of restraint. It also produced some of the most influential philosophical writing in the Western canon and a couple of national heroes. None of that makes the underlying age dynamic comfortable to a modern reader, and no serious classicist tries to pretend otherwise. What it does mean is that classical Athens, the city that gave us democracy and tragedy and Socratic philosophy, was also a place where a 14-year-old boy walked into a gymnasium under the watch of a household slave, was offered a hair by a 40-year-old aristocrat, and was expected to navigate a series of social rules so detailed and so unforgiving that one wrong move could disqualify him from public office for life. The Eromenos was not just a participant in an unequal romance. He was a category of citizen in training, a legal subject, an art historical motif, and a recurring figure in 3 different schools of philosophy. Your life as one is, depending on the year, the family, and the man holding the hair, either a long apprenticeship in restraint or a slow-motion legal disaster. Athens never quite settled the question of which it was, and 3,000 years later, neither have we. But the hair on the wine cup is still there. So is the boy. So is the man on the bench. And every museum in Europe has a basement full of them.